The alarm started as a murmur in the border surveillance subsystem and reached the Imperial Council chamber like a thunderclap. Silas, supreme leader of the Eternal Dominion and 19th holder of the Golden Scale throne, didn't deign to rise from his seat for minor news. But there was something in the hunched posture of Chief Cartographer Vincent as he approached the throne steps, that data crystal trembling between his scaled fingers, that made Silas reconsider his policy for a moment. The council chamber was an engineering marvel designed to intimidate. Built into the heart of Nexus Station, which had orbited the binary sun of Valdron for 8,000 years, its translucent obsidian walls captured the light of the two stars and refracted it into beams that illuminated the counselors' faces from below. It emphasized their heavy jaws and facial ridges in a way that diplomats from subjugated species always described in their secret reports as terrifying. That was exactly the intended effect. Vincent placed the crystal into the central projector, and an image materialized in the air, a metallic structure no larger than a patrol corvette, floating alone in the vacuum of Sector 749. There was nothing imposing about it. No visible cannons, no armor suggesting military purpose, no symbol of a larger fleet beyond the sensor horizon. It was, in every technical sense of the word, a buoy. A beacon, Supreme Leader, Vincent said, choosing the neutral tone of someone delivering explosive information while hoping the blast wouldn't hit him. First detected 432 years ago by passive surveillance on the Outer Rim. Catalogued as a secondary phenomenon. Reclassified this morning after the incident involving Lieutenant Kevin. What incident? Silas's voice had the quality of stone being split in half. The lieutenant brought his scout ship within 100 units to collect energy signature samples. The beacon detected him, initiated an open-frequency broadcast in 48 cataloged languages and 14 uncatalogued ones, and then performed an autonomous repair on its own hull while the lieutenant watched. A microfracture in the structure, likely caused by a micrometeoroid impact, was sealed in 3 minutes and 42 seconds by nanofabricators the lieutenant had never seen before. The silence in the chamber was the kind that preceded a death sentence. "The broadcast," Silas said. "What did it say?" Vincent touched the crystal, and a voice filled the room. It was a human voice, though no one present knew that yet. The Dominion's universal translator, powered by centuries of linguistic conquest, rendered the words into the formal dialect of Old Valdronian. Attention. You are approaching the sovereign space of the Terran Confederation. This territory is under the full protection of the Confederation Articles of Peace, ratified 382 years ago. Any unauthorized entry beyond these coordinates will be considered an act of open aggression. We do not seek conflict. We seek only peace. Please respect this border. This warning will be the only one you receive before response measures are initiated. Safe travels. The message ended. It started again automatically. It kept looping. Elder Counselor Margaret, the oldest of the 7 permanent members and the only one to survive 4 regime changes for reasons no one could quite explain, let out a sound that, for her species, was a thoughtful breath. She was 940 years old and had developed a peculiar instinct for recognizing the difference between empty threats and genuine warnings. This one, she realized with a clarity that bordered on discomfort, sounded far too genuine. 4 centuries, she said, breaking protocol by speaking without permission. The beacon has been functioning for 4 centuries without visible maintenance. It repairs itself. It broadcasts in languages that didn't even exist when it was built. Universal translators are remotely updatable, said General Drake, adjusting his cloak embroidered with the 1,000 Conquests emblem. Known technology. No mystery there. None of our universal translators work for 4 centuries without a support station, Margaret countered. And none of our nanofabricators operate in the field without supervision for more than 3 years before critical degradation. This unit repaired structural damage with surgical precision after more than 400 years of autonomous operation in a vacuum, with temperature swings of 500 degrees between the sector's day and night. This is not known technology. Silas looked at the image of the beacon with an expression his counselors knew meant decision made. Discussion is just protocol. "What lies beyond the beacon?" he asked. Vincent swapped the crystal. A map of Sector 749 and the 3 adjacent sectors appeared. It was a rich region. Systems with rocky planets in habitable zones, asteroid belts overflowing with heavy minerals, nebulae with ideal hydrogen density for fuel harvesting. 6 systems showed clear signs of terraforming and automated mining. No readings of dense populations, no wide-spectrum communication signals. Just silence, continuous work, and automation. "A civilization that doesn't want to be found," Margaret said. "That alone should give us pause." "Or a civilization that doesn't know it's being found," Drake said. "Automated systems managing territories while the population lives behind a barrier they assume is impenetrable. It's likely the remnant of a declining species, sustained by machinery far older and more advanced than their current ability to replicate." "Possible," Margaret agreed. "Equally possible it's a species that prefers to show only its smallest claw rather than its fist." Silas stood up. It was a rare gesture, reserved for declarations that needed physical weight. "For 400 years," he said, descending the throne steps with the deliberate slowness his predecessors had cultivated as a tool of power, the Eternal Dominion has ruled the known galaxy. 12,000 years in total since the first conquest. 973 subjugated species. 42 rival empires dissolved. 8 wars of extinction won. He stopped before the projected map and placed his claw over Sector 749. "And now a buoy, floating in the void, wants to tell me where I can and cannot go?" No one spoke. "Admiral Keith," Silas said, turning to the man who commanded the first-line fleet, 60 years of campaigns etched into every scar on his ceremonial armor. "You will take 40,000 warships beyond this border. Neutralize any resistance. Catalog every navigable system, and bring back evidence to this council that there is nothing in that space the Eternal Dominion cannot claim with the same hand it uses to hold the rest of the galaxy." Keith bowed his head. "For the glory of the Dominion." Margaret didn't move for a long time after the chamber began to clear. She stared at the still projected image of the beacon, small and quiet against the infinite void, broadcasting its patient, endless warning to no one who wanted to hear it. A warning, not a threat. The distinction felt fundamental to her. A civilization that threatens needs you to believe it can act. A civilization that warns no longer needs to prove anything. She left the chamber without asking for leave. No one questioned her. They never questioned Margaret, and she had survived 4 regime changes for that exact reason. Out in the vacuum of Sector 749, the beacon kept broadcasting. It would keep broadcasting as long as there was energy in the universe to power it, because it had been built by people who knew, from experience and from scars that weren't physical but were just as permanent, that warnings needed to be patient, that empires always arrive, that empires always choose not to listen, and that the moment following the broken silence is always, invariably, the moment the galaxy learns something new about itself. Admiral Keith's fleet would take 14 days to organize. The beacon had already recalibrated its sensors, updated its logs, and transmitted a pulse of encrypted data toward a distant point in Terran space. Message received. Border breach in 14 days. Response protocol initiated. Somewhere very far away, someone read that message and sighed with a weariness 4,000 years deep. Admiral Keith had participated in 42 campaigns in his 60 years of service. He had seen fleets reduced to debris, entire civilizations negotiating surrender with the trembling voices of those who realized too late there is no way out. He had learned to recognize the smell of fear in 10 different species, to read the body language of enemies who didn't yet know they were enemies. and to distinguish between genuine courage and the desperation that looks like it but breaks on the third strike. None of that had prepared him for the silence. Not the silence of space, which was constant and expected. The silence of the systems his fleet had traversed in the 3 days after crossing the beacon. 46 stars, 118 planets with navigable atmospheres, lands cultivated in geometric patterns visible from orbit, automated mines operating on asteroids with an efficiency his chief engineers described with ill-disguised discomfort as superior in extraction density to our own third-generation tech. Everything working, everything devoid of direct presence, no active communication signals, no manned transport vehicles, no defense satellites, no orbital stations, no response to his fleet's hailing attempts beyond the beacons still broadcasting behind them, fading in intensity with distance, but never going completely silent. "They're ghosts," Vice Admiral Leonard said on the third day, sounding like he was trying to convince himself the simplest explanation was the right one. A civilization that collapsed centuries ago, leaving its automated systems running. Automated systems that repair themselves, update their broadcasts in new languages, and send encrypted pulses toward deep space, replied Sensor Commander Valerie, who had developed the expression of someone reading a book and slowly realizing the protagonist isn't going to make it. They aren't ghosts, they're sentries, and they know we're here. Keith hadn't been sleeping well. It wasn't the kind of thing a Dominion admiral would admit out loud, but there was something about the geometry of that space that disturbed his tactical sense. In 42 campaigns, the enemy always revealed their position before the confrontation. There were always scout ships to track, comm stations to intercept, visible nervousness and preparation. The total absence of any alarm signal wasn't reassuring. It was the exact opposite. The Kepler system, the catalog designation for a yellow star with 7 orbiting planets, the 4th being an ocean world with a blue-green atmosphere that sensors identified as habitable and potentially inhabited, was where the anomaly appeared. Valerie called Keith to the sensor hub with an urgency he had learned to respect. "A ship," she said. "Just one." The display showed an organic shape, not metallic in the conventional sense, but built with materials the fleet's spectrometers described as a dense polymer structure of uncatalogued origin, with energy absorption properties consistent with high-grade shielding, but without the corresponding thermal signature. In other words, material that absorbed energy without heating up, which was physically improbable to the point that the fleet's chief engineer called it likely a sensor error. The ship was small, no larger than a Dominion light cruiser, no visible weapons, no active propulsion emissions. Just floating, steady and serene, between the fleet of 40,000 ships and the blue-green planet in the background. The transmission arrived before Keith could finish analyzing the display. The voice was human, and the translator rendered it without difficulty. It was an adult voice, neither young nor old, with the quality of someone repeating something they'd said many times and still believed was worth saying once more. "Admiral, I know that is your rank. My name is Commander Elena Vasquez, Terran Confederation, Response Vessel Perseverance. You crossed our border 72 hours ago. We have tracked every move of your fleet. There is nothing in this space you can take without our permission. And there is no tactical configuration that gives you an advantage against us. I am offering you the same thing the beacon offered, a way out. Turn your fleet around, return to your border, and not a single ship of yours will be damaged. This is not weakness on my part. It is consideration for the lives of your crew. Please choose wisely." The command deck went silent for exactly 4 seconds. Then Vice Admiral Leonard made the sound that, for his species, was a laugh. "One ship," he said. "A single ship, broadcasting pleas for mercy." Keith looked at the human ship on the display. He looked at the sensor readings. He looked at the surrounding space, scanned 3 times in the last few hours with no sign of additional forces. Something in Commander Vasquez's voice had triggered the same instinct that had kept him alive through 42 campaigns, the ability to recognize when someone knew exactly what they were doing. But 40,000 ships against one was an equation that allowed no other interpretation. "Full fire," he ordered. "Primary batteries. Leave nothing larger than my hand." What happened next was described in subsequent reports with a precision that couldn't hide the shock. 40,000 ships opened fire simultaneously. The visible result was a storm of energy concentrated on the point where the human ship sat. For 43 seconds, it was impossible to see anything beyond the combined discharge of weapons that, in the last 1,000 campaigns, had reduced moons to rubble. When the discharge stopped, the Perseverance was exactly where it had been before. No visible damage, no change in structural readings, no change in hull temperature. It had absorbed everything. And then began what the fleet engineers would simply call the procedure for lack of better technical vocabulary. There was no counterattack, no visible weapons. What happened was this: the fusion reactors of the ships began to enter a forced hibernation mode in concentric wave patterns, starting from the ships closest to the Perseverance and expanding outward like ripples in water. No explosions, no structural damage, simply power systems being shut down with the gentleness of someone turning off lights in empty rooms. System operators on the affected ships reported the same thing. Controls wouldn't respond, but life support systems remained functional. Temperature stable, oxygen stable. The crews were adrift, but not in immediate danger. The shutdown pattern hit the flagship Valorum 1 11 minutes and 42 seconds after the procedure began. Keith stood on the darkened bridge, main systems offline, emergency lights tinting everything amber, and counted the ships on his auxiliary display powered by backup batteries. 40,000 dots, 40,000 ships, drifting in silence. Commander Vasquez's transmission returned. "Admiral, your crews are safe. Life support on all ships remains active. We have sent location pulses to the nearest navigation routes to ensure rescue ships from your dominion can recover them. It will take between 6 and 8 days. Life support will last 14. Your crews will return home." A pause. "This was our mercy. Please convey to your supreme leader that there will not be a second opportunity of this kind. We do not want war, but we will not run from it." The transmission ended. Keith stared into the darkness of the bridge for a long time. He thought of Elder Counselor Margaret and her distinction between warnings and threats. He thought of the 42 campaigns and the equation he had made before ordering fire. 40,000 ships against one. The equation was correct. He had simply used the wrong values. Outside, the Perseverance remained still for a few more minutes. Then, without any detectable propulsion, it simply wasn't there anymore. The space around the Kepler system returned to the silence it had kept for centuries. The blue-green planet continued to spin with its geological patience, and 40,000 ships of the greatest military force in the known galaxy drifted, waiting for rescue, while their crews had 6 to 14 days to think about what had happened. Some would use that time well. Admiral Keith was executed 8 days after his return to Nexus Station. The sentence was announced in terms the Eternal Dominion had refined over 12,000 years of practice: catastrophic failure of duty, cowardice in the face of the enemy, surrender without combat. That 40,000 ships had been deactivated without a single shot from the human side was a detail the official record chose to omit with the bureaucratic elegance that separated long-lasting empires from those that collapsed in 3 generations. Elder Counselor Margaret watched the sentencing the same way she had watched everything for the last 3 decades. In silence, with her eyes open and her judgment tucked away somewhere inside her where loyalty scanners couldn't reach. She had requested an audience with Silas before the sentence. It had been granted. It had lasted 4 minutes. "Supreme Leader," she had said, Admiral Keith executed the invasion order with precision. The result was not a product of incompetence. It was a product of misunderstanding the threat. Executing him doesn't change the tactical equation. It only removes a 60-year veteran from active service, one who survived the encounter and now carries first-hand information about human capabilities. What he carries, Silas had replied, is the reputation of an admiral who lost 40,000 ships to a single enemy vessel. Leaving him alive is leaving the narrative of our defeat alive. With respect, Supreme Leader, defeat doesn't disappear just because you execute the witness. Silas had looked at her with the expression she had known for 200 years. Ever since he had taken the Golden Scale throne at the age of 380, young for a supreme leader and already completely convinced that the universe was an equation with a single variable: will. You are dismissed, counselor. She had left. Keith had been executed, and Silas had summoned the 7 generals to the war chamber. General Drake had presented his analysis with the confidence of a man who had decided on the conclusion before looking at the data. Humanity had demonstrated superior defensive capability, but no offensive capability. The Perseverance hadn't fired a single lethal projectile. It had shut down systems. It had incapacitated. It had, in Drake's reading, demonstrated a fundamental reluctance to cause real harm. They could have destroyed the fleet, he said, tactical maps spinning over the war table. They didn't. That isn't strategy. It's moral hesitation. They don't have the stomach for true combat. Or, Margaret said, because she had been invited to the meeting and had learned in 940 years that silence sometimes costs more than words, they simply didn't need to. There is a difference between being unable to kill and choosing not to kill. The distinction is irrelevant in practice, Drake replied. If the enemy doesn't use their full capacity due to moral restrictions, their moral restrictions become our tactical advantage. Margaret wanted to say many things. She said only one. The history of every species that applied that logic to humanity is, apparently, incomplete. No one responded to that, and she noticed the lack of response, which was a different kind of answer. Silas listened to Drake's analysis and made a decision with the speed of someone who had already decided before entering the room. The mobilization of the Grand Armada would take 3 months. 2 million warships, the complete strategic reserve of the Eternal Dominion, every ship of the line available across all 18 imperial sectors. A force that had been held in reserve for 600 years, since the last war of extinction against the Zelthorum, who were now a footnote in 4 encyclopedias and an example in 3 strategy treatises. The new Grand Admiral would be Victor, too young to have participated in Keith's campaigns, but old enough to have studied every one of them. 52 years old. 87 simulated battles with top honors. 23 real campaigns, all in peripheral sectors against civilizations. He now, revisiting them for the first time with different eyes, realized never had a real chance to resist. Victor had read the Kepler system reports 3 times. He had requested the original sensor logs, not the edited versions that reached the official archive, and had managed to obtain them through a survivor's engineer who had kept his own copies with the discreet prudence of someone who knows the official archive has convenient gaps. What the logs showed was this: the Perseverance hadn't just shut down the power systems. Sometime between the 7th and 10th minute of the procedure, the computers of the affected ships had received and processed a volume of external data without triggering any firewall protocols. No cyber defense system had registered an intrusion. It was as if the invasion was conducted in a language the defense systems simply didn't recognize as an invasion, as if human technology operated at a level of abstraction so far above the Dominion systems that the difference wasn't one of degree, but of category. Victor kept that observation in his own mental file, separate from the one he would deliver to General Drake. The mobilization moved forward. 2 million warships began to converge from the 18 sectors to the assembly point at the edge of Sector 748, one star system away from the beacon. The space in that region, which had been empty except for routine patrols, became a structure of metal and energy larger than some catalogued nebulae. Victor took his post on the flagship Glory of Valdrun, a leviathan of war capable of carrying 30,000 soldiers and enough firepower to sterilize planetary atmospheres. He looked at the formation around him through the sensor displays and felt, for the first time in his career, something that wasn't exactly fear, but occupied the same emotional space. The night before departure, he received an encrypted message from Elder Counselor Margaret. It wasn't protocol. It was one of the things Margaret did that made her survival through 4 regimes so curious. She treated people as if they might, eventually, make better choices. The message said, "Grand Admiral, I'll save you some time. The humans know you're coming. The beacon has transmitted data pulses every 12 hours since the fleet began to mobilize. They have 3 months of data on our preparation. If they wanted to stop us before we crossed the border, they've already had time to consider it. The fact that they haven't means either they can't, which contradicts the Kepler system, or they are letting you arrive. Think about why a civilization that demonstrated the ability to disable 40,000 ships with a single vessel would be waiting to see what you do with 2 million. Victor read the message twice, then deleted it from the comm logs, which was exactly what Margaret had expected him to do, and exactly why she had sent it in a way that guaranteed no copies would remain in any archive. Some warnings were meant to survive only in the mind of the recipient. The Grand Armada departed at dawn on the 9th day of the assembly. 2 million ships crossed the beacon in a column that took 11 hours to fully traverse the border. The beacon transmitted its warning patiently during all 11 hours and sent a data pulse the exact moment the last ship crossed the line. Somewhere far away, someone received that pulse, and the conversation that followed in a chamber no citizen of the Dominion had ever seen lasted only as long as necessary to confirm what had already been planned. Victor navigated through the systems in silence, observing the same empty landscapes Keith's fleet had described. Worked worlds, efficient automation, total absence of direct presence. But this time, there was something different. His fleet's long-range sensors picked up anomalies at the very edge of detection, gravitational inflection points that didn't correspond to any known mass. As if something very large was moving at a distance his sensors could barely reach, with no detectable emissions, no conventional energy signature. Like shadows at the edge of peripheral vision. The first inhabited world they found was called, in their own records, Sanctuary. The name had been recorded by the beacon in the data pulses that the Dominion's intelligence system had patiently decoded during the 3 months of preparation. A world with green continents and blue oceans, a breathable atmosphere, and populations of 3 different species living together in settlements that sensors indicated were ancient and prosperous. Not humans. Other species, different from the Dominions, living freely under the protection of the Terran Confederation. Drake, overseeing the campaign remotely from Nexus Station, ordered a planetary bombardment. Send the clearest message possible. Demonstrate that the human mercy of the Kepler system would not be reciprocated. Victor looked at the planet on the display. He looked at the gravitational anomalies at the edge of sensor range. He thought of Margaret's message. He thought of the word waiting. He opened the communication channel to the bombardment formation and said, "Hold your fire." Then he waited. It didn't take long. They arrived from all sides at once. It wasn't tactical hyperbole. It was the literal description of what the Glory of Valdrun's sensors recorded. The space around the Grand Armada tore open at multiple simultaneous points, not along conventional approach vectors, but at coordinates distributed around the entire Imperial formation, as if someone had decided on the geometric pattern beforehand and executed every entry point with nanosecond precision. The gravitational anomalies Victor had tracked at the edge of sensor range weren't shadows. They were anchors, stabilization points for something that hadn't been in conventional space until the moment it chose to be. The Terran Confederation ships were different from the Perseverance in ways the Armada's sensor engineers would take weeks to document and still describe incompletely. Organic structures of varying scales, some no larger than a Dominion corvette, others comparable in volume to space stations, all built with the same dense polymer material that sensors insisted on describing as having anomalous energy absorption. 400,000 ships materializing at 42 simultaneous points in less than 8 seconds. The sensor commander of the Glory of Valdrin stared at the data for a long moment before saying, with a composure Victor admired in retrospect, "Grand Admiral, we've been surrounded. The numerical ratio still favored the Dominion, 5-1. But the data from the Kepler system was present in Victor's mind with the sharpness of something read 3 times and memorized on the second. 1 human ship, 40,000 Dominion ships. Result, 40,000 ships drifting, 1 human ship intact. The question wasn't whether a 5-1 ratio was enough. The question was whether 1,000,000 human ships could repeat what one had done, and if the answer was yes, then the numerical ratio was a comforting illusion with no tactical value. The transmission arrived from multiple vectors simultaneously, which was technically impossible and yet happening, the signal coherent and single, despite originating from hundreds of sources at once. The voice was different from Commander Vasquez's. Older, with the calm authority of someone who doesn't need to raise their voice to be heard. Grand Admiral Victor. My name is Admiral Gideon Okafor, Terran Confederation Defense Force. You are in a position of complete encirclement. The planet's sanctuary is under active protection. There will be no bombardment today. Victor activated the response channel. Admiral Okafor. You are aware that our numerical force outnumbers yours 5-1. I am, Okafor replied. Are you aware that it isn't relevant? It wasn't a question. It was a statement with the texture of a geological fact. Then what is relevant? Victor asked. There was a pause of exactly 4 seconds, which Victor later recognized as the kind of pause someone takes when choosing words carefully, because the words that follow determine whether the next few hours end one way or another. What is relevant, Okafor said, is what happens next. You can order the attack. We will deactivate your armada exactly as we deactivated your previous fleet, but on a larger scale. Your crews will return home. But your supreme leader will send more ships, because that is what empires do when they don't find a limit they respect. And at some point in this escalation, Grand Admiral, we will reach a threshold. And what lies on the other side of that threshold is something my civilization has spent 4,000 years building safeguards to avoid. What lies on the other side? Victor asked. A version of humanity you do not want to meet, Okafor replied. Believe that. Victor looked at the sensor displays. 400,000 human ships motionless, waiting. 2 million Dominion ships, formation held by discipline and a lack of alternatives. The planet's sanctuary spinning serenely in the background, its inhabitants completely oblivious to the armada that had arrived to destroy them and the force that had arrived to stop it. He could order the attack. It was technically what his mandate required. It was what Drake expected of him. 6 light hours away at Nexus Station, monitoring telemetry with the satisfaction of someone who isn't the one paying the price of the decision. Instead, he said, Admiral Okafor, I would like to continue this conversation. I hoped you would say that, Okafor replied, and Victor had the feeling he had been read with more precision than any sensor scanner could achieve. What followed over the next 6 hours was technically a preliminary negotiation, but Elder Counselor Margaret's later analysis would describe it as the only moment in this entire crisis when someone with authority on both sides was genuinely willing to think. Victor asked questions. Okafor answered some directly, dodged others with the skill of a diplomat who knows the difference between transparency and strategic recklessness, and around them, the two forces remained in position, suspended in balance. During this time, the 400,000 human ships did nothing aggressive, But they did something the Dominion's sensor engineers would later catalog as a calibrated demonstration of capability. From time to time, a human ship would briefly turn on a power system in a frequency visible to Dominion sensors, showing a power profile that didn't correspond to any known fusion reactor, and then turn it off, like someone showing their cards to an opponent, not to play, but to make it clear the cards existed. Sensor Commander Valeri, who had survived the Kepler system and been promoted for correctly documenting the anomalies, sent a private report to Victor during the second hour of negotiations. The report said, "The energy readings from the human ships are consistent with magnetic confinement antimatter reactors, but with energy densities that exceed any antimatter reactor in our engineering literature by 3 orders of magnitude. For comparison, the total energy stored in a single medium-sized human ship exceeds the combined total energy of our entire armada." Victor reread the report. Then he reread it again. Then he understood, with the cold clarity of a solved equation, why Admiral Okafor had spoken of a threshold with that heavy, calm voice. It wasn't that the humans couldn't destroy the armada, it was that destroying the armada would be, for them, technically trivial. What they were doing by using only defensive and neutralization capabilities wasn't hesitation. It was an active choice. It was the deliberate application of a containment policy that required more willpower to maintain than any weapon to use. When Drake sent the direct order for bombardment at 6:42 p.m. Standard Time, Victor turned off the communication channel with Nexus Station for 42 minutes. Then he reopened it and said there had been irresolvable technical interference in the subsector. No one believed it. But there was a tradition in the Eternal Dominion of accepting plausible explanations when the alternative was documenting something the official record couldn't process without implicating people who were inconvenient to implicate. At 9:00 p.m., Victor asked Admiral Okafor for a physical meeting. Aboard a human ship, in neutral territory defined by the very balance point between the two forces, Afor agreed without hesitation. The transport ship that came to collect him was smaller, clearly a purpose-built vessel, and on board were only 3 humans. Admiral Okafor, an officer who wasn't introduced but whose behavior suggested security duties, and a third person, older than the other 2, with white hair and eyes that carried the kind of weariness that doesn't come from lack of sleep but from an excess of history. It was this third person who spoke first. "Grand Admiral Victor," she said, "my name is Dr. Amara Mensa. I am the Chief Archivist of the Terran Confederation. I am here because Admiral Okafor believes you are someone who needs to understand, not just listen." "Understand what?" Victor asked. "Why the warnings exist," she replied. "Why they are warnings and not preemptive strikes. Why we, who can do what you saw today on an immensely larger scale, choose a lonely beacon in the void instead of an impenetrable galactic shield." She opened a holographic display that projected into the air between them. Not tactical maps. Historical records. Images of a past that Dr. Mensa described with the voice of someone carrying a weight they chose to carry because there is no other place to put it. 4,000 years ago, she said, humanity was nearly extinct. Victor listened. And as he listened, something in his understanding of the universe began, slowly, to be reconstructed. 4,000 years ago, the humans had been found. Not in the way galactic history usually framed first contact, with diplomacy and caution and the slow process of calibrating intentions. They had been found the same way prey is found, identified as a resource, cataloged as a minor obstacle, and addressed with the efficiency of a species that had done the same to 12 others before. Dr. Amara Mensa spoke for 40 minutes. Victor didn't interrupt her once. The Deshkai, she said, was the name given to them by human records. What name they called themselves remained an unanswered question because the policy of total extinction humans eventually applied left nothing behind to answer it. 4,000 years ago, humanity was a young civilization with modest expansion, confined to 57 star systems, with accelerated sublight propulsion and the first experiments in warp drive. They weren't fragile, but they weren't warriors. They were, in the language of the time, explorers and colonizers, a species that had learned to cooperate out of necessity and carried that habit to the stars. The Deshkai arrived with 3,000 ships and the stated intent, found in their own internal documentation later recovered, to assimilate the biological and mineral resources of interest system 7749, which was what they called the Sun and its planets. The war that followed lasted 40 years, not because humans were failing, but because it took time for humanity to realize they were fighting a civilization that didn't recognize the concept of surrender, that lacked the cultural vocabulary to process any outcome other than the complete extinction of their adversary. In the first 10 years, humanity lost 43 colonies, and Earth was nearly hit twice. Over the next 15 years, humanity mobilized a response that began as defense and transformed, by necessity, into something else. Scientists who had dedicated their careers to basic astrophysics were redirected to military applications. Engineers who had built field generators for terraforming discovered that the same physics that contained atmospheres could contain antimatter blasts. In 15 years of existential necessity, humanity developed technologies that would normally have taken centuries. But technology wasn't the most important part. The most important thing, Dr. Mensah said, resting her hands on the table and looking at Vorseth with eyes full of historical weight, was the realization of a truth about themselves that humanity had never had to face before, that when pushed to the brink of the end, they were capable of things for which there was no precedent in their own history, things that worked, things that won, things they would be ashamed of for the rest of their existence. The extermination of the Deshkai was complete in 7 years. Not a single surviving system, not a single individual confirmed to have escaped. Humanity had responded to an attempted extinction with the most efficient tool at its disposal, and it had been so efficient that nothing remained to document the extinction except their own records of having carried it out. And then? Vorseth asked. And then, Dr. Mensah said, we had to live with it. She touched the holographic display, and the historical records gave way to philosophical documents, records of debates, and foundational laws written in the years immediately following the Deshkai extinction, with the urgency of people trying to build a fence around something that couldn't simply be suppressed by will. The Terran Confederation was born in that period, not as a government of conquest, but as a structure of containment. Its central mandate, written in 3,000 words, reread in public ceremonies every generation, was this: humanity recognizes in itself a capacity for total destruction that it does not wish to exercise. The Confederation exists to ensure that the conditions that forced its previous exercise never repeat. Isolationism isn't cowardice. It's the most honest way we've found to be responsible for our own nature. The beacon, Vorseth said, and it wasn't a question, but a conclusion. The beacon, Dr. Mensah confirmed. It's not a threat. It's a confession. It says, we know what we are when we have no other choice. Please, don't force us to have no other choice. The silence that followed lasted long enough for Vorseth to process not just what he had heard, but what he had been looking at without seeing. That the Terran Confederation's mercy in the Kepler system and here over Sanctuary wasn't moral hesitation. It was the active application of a philosophy that required more willpower than any weapon required to fire. It was humanity choosing, repeatedly and with full awareness of the alternatives, not to be what it could be. You're telling me, he said carefully, that the Terran Confederation is more dangerous than it has shown. I'm saying, Dr. Mensah replied, that we've shown exactly enough for you to reach that conclusion without us needing to say more. Admiral Okafor, who had remained silent throughout the conversation with the stillness of someone who had heard this story many times and knew it needed space to land, spoke then for the first time in 40 minutes. "Grand Admiral, I'm not here to intimidate you. I'm here because, unlike your predecessor, you didn't order the bombardment when you could have. That tells me who you are, and who you are determines if what I say next hits the right mark." "Then say it," Vorseth replied. "Go home. Take your ships. Take your crews. Take this conversation back to the throne of golden scales and tell the Overlord exactly what you heard. Not an edited version, not a narrative that protects careers, but this story, this truth about what lies on the other side of this border. And if he doesn't listen, then we'll have another conversation," Okafor said, "one I'd rather not have, and one that the people whose job it is to prevent humanity from needing to have also prefer doesn't happen." Vorseth was silent for a moment. Then he asked something that had been on his mind since the censor reports from Vrael Ka, something he had held back because it seemed like the most revealing question of how far his understanding had come. "You have ships elsewhere now, not just here." Afor didn't answer, but the silence was an answer. "The Great Armada isn't the only variable you're monitoring," Vorseth continued. "You have visibility of our entire structure, not just the border. The beacon has existed for 400 years, Dr. Mensa said softly. 4 centuries of transmissions, data pulses, and response receivers in every galactic language, on frequencies covering the entire communication spectrum we've cataloged. We pay attention, Grand Admiral. It's what civilizations that need to defend themselves without attacking learn to do first." The conversation ended shortly after. The transport ship took Vorseth back to his flagship through a hatch that closed silently and a stretch of space that somehow felt vaster than it had before. He stood in the command chamber for an hour before activating any communication channel. He thought of Keth Var, executed by a narrative. He thought of Myreth and her distinction between warnings and threats. He thought of the 400,000 human ships around him, motionless, waiting, carrying in their antimatter reactors energy densities that exceeded his entire armada like the ocean exceeds a drop. He thought of a species that had exterminated its attackers so completely they were erased from galactic history, and that had built a lonely buoy in the vacuum to plead, patient and endless, that they not be forced to do it again. There was a type of power Vorseth had learned to respect in 60 years of military service. The power that doesn't need to prove itself in every confrontation. The power that can choose not to use it because it is comfortable with what it is. The Eternal Dominion had built its entire identity on the continuous demonstration of power. Every conquest reaffirmed the next. Every victory fed the need for the following one. The Great Armada around him was the expression of 12,000 years of a civilization that couldn't stop because stopping would mean facing the question of who it was without the conquests to define the answer. The Terran Confederation had answered that question differently, with a story of horror and shame and the determination held for 4,000 years and becoming increasingly expensive to maintain, not to have to answer it again. Vorseth opened the communication channel to Nexcareth Station. Drathker was waiting, with the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time and had used that time to get angrier. "Grand Admiral," he said, "explain the silence of the last 6 hours." "I was meeting with the human command," Vorseth replied. "Hi, General, I need an audience with the Overlord. Personal, urgent, and I need it to be recorded." "Recorded?" "Yes," Vorseth said. "I need what I'm going to report to be in the Dominion's permanent archive. Unedited." Drathker's silence lasted as long as a man calculating implications. "What are you going to report?" he finally asked. "The truth," Vorseth replied, "which is the only thing that can save us from a conversation that none of us will survive in any recognizable way." Behind him, in the space around Sanctuary, the 400,000 human ships waited, patient, like the beacon, like always. There was a version of humanity that the galaxy should never have to know, and there was a version of it that stood there, suspended between what it could do and what it chose to do, and called it peace. It was the most disciplined thing Vorseth had ever seen in his life. The audience with Zarath's soul took place 48 hours after the Great Armada's return to Sector 748, and it was the longest individual audience recorded in the history of the Throne of Golden Scales in 300 years. 6 hours and 20 minutes, with all records active, exactly as Vorseth had demanded. Mirath heard about the outcome before the official announcement, because it was the kind of thing she had learned to anticipate. The Overlord had remained silent for 42 minutes after Vorseth finished his report. Then he had ordered everyone present except Vorseth and the recorders to leave the room. Then he had remained silent for another 20 minutes. What went through Zarath Sol's mind during those 20 minutes, no one could say for sure. But when he spoke again, what he said was this: if what you describe is accurate, then the moment the humans chose not to destroy the First Fleet, they demonstrated more strength than the Eternal Dominion has shown in 12,000 years of conquest. Vorseth had responded carefully. Overlord, I believe that is a correct reading of the situation. Another silence. What do they want? That we leave them in peace, and that we liberate the species we have subjugated. That is the formal ultimatum Admiral Okafor authorized me to convey. And if we don't? Vorseth had paused before answering, not out of hesitation, but for the same reason Dr. Mensah had chosen her words carefully. Because some things, said in certain ways, land in ways others don't. Then they will give us the second chance they said they wouldn't. And the second chance will not be the mercy of the first. The final silence had lasted 16 minutes. Then Zarath Sol had said, "Prepare the terms of withdrawal." Mirath learned all of this and went to her office and sat for a considerable time, looking out the window at the binary sun of Valdrun. She had lived 940 years. She had seen 4 regime changes and 46 wars and a number of political decisions that had cultivated in her the ability to be surprised by nothing. She was, at this moment, close to what she would describe as surprise. Not by the result, by the path. By a single Grand Admiral who had read the right reports, asked the right questions, and survived long enough to tell what he had seen in a way that reached the place it needed to reach. It was the kind of thing that gave hope. Mirath had learned in 940 years to be careful with hope, but she had also learned to recognize it when it was genuine. The withdrawal was ordered. It took 2 months to execute in a way that looked like a strategic choice rather than a surrender, because empires need narratives as much as they need territories. And transitional stability depended on leaving some narrative standing. But the terms were real. The Eternal Dominion would retreat to its original 17 systems. Subjugated species would receive recognition of sovereignty in stages. A 100-year process, negotiated by representatives from both sides through a communication channel the Terran Confederation quietly established, operated by human translators who spoke Valdrunian with a fluency that suggested decades of preparation for this exact moment. Mirath once asked the human representative, a man named Dr. Marcus Webb, who had gray hair and the expression of someone who had chosen that career, knowing it would take decades to produce a result if the Confederation had really prepared this process in advance. Doctor. Webb had smiled. The beacon was placed 400 years ago. We knew someone at some point would cross. We prepared for several possible outcomes, including this one, he had confirmed. We call it the hopeful outcome. Statistically the least likely among the possibilities, but we, as a civilization, have a particular relationship with the improbable. The Confederation's indirect tactics became clear over the next 3 years. There was no invasion of Valdrunian space. There was no demonstration of military force beyond what had already been shown. What there was something more subtle and, in the end, more effective. Secure communication technology packages arriving for the leaders of the resistance movements of the subjugated species. Defensive shield technology shared through channels the Dominion couldn't track. Information, connectivity. The simplest and most revolutionary tool an isolated and fragmented civilization can receive. The ability to know it is not alone. The revolutions began in Sector 12, spread to Sector 7, and within 3 years had reached 12 of the 18 imperial sectors. They weren't wars of liberation in the sense of battlefronts and fleet confrontations. They were general strikes, refusals to collaborate, local administrations that stopped transmitting reports to the capital and started transmitting to each other. The Dominion's structure of domination, which had depended for 12,000 years on every subjugated species believing it was isolated and that resistance was impossible, discovered that both premises had ceased to be true simultaneously. Zerath Sol abdicated before his capital was surrounded. It was the smartest decision he had made in his reign, and Mirith recognized that, because the alternative was symbolic resistance that would produce exactly the kind of despair that could cross the threshold the Confederation had described. The Eternal Dominion survived its own transformation. It was what the Confederation had planned, not to destroy, but to change the conditions that made destructive behavior the only option available. A philosophical difference, Dr. Webb had once described to Mirith as the distinction between treating a symptom and treating the cause. In the 100 years that followed, the territory that had been the Eternal Dominion reorganized into 12 distinct sovereign entities, each negotiating its form of existence with the others and with the wider galaxy. It wasn't peaceful, because real peace rarely is. There were disputes and negotiations and crises that needed mediation, but there was also, for the first time in 12,000 years, the vocabulary to resolve crises through means other than conquest. The Terran Confederation remained behind its border throughout this entire process. Present when asked, absent when not needed, too consistent to be ignored, and too discreet to be resented. Mirith lived to see the first 180 years of the transformation. She died at 1,120 years old, considered the intellectual architect of the transition, a title she had refused with the patience of someone who knows that titles are for history books, and history books always simplify. She had left a note, found in her personal archives, that said only, "Listen when someone tells you they don't want to destroy you. It is the most important thing anyone can say." 300 years after all of this, a young woman named Kyle Mir, 22 years old, a student of galactic history and a direct descendant of the lineage that had sat on the throne of Golden Scales, traveled to Sector 749 in a research ship carrying 3 passengers and a volume of scientific equipment she had spent 2 years funding through academic grants. She had read about the beacon. She had studied the records of the confrontation, the negotiations, and Vorseth's report, which was in the Dominion's permanent archive exactly as he had demanded. She had read Mirith's writings. She had written her doctoral thesis on the philosophy of containment as a civilization strategy. And now she was here, 50 units away from the original beacon, which continued transmitting with the same patience as 300 years ago, having transmitted for 732 years in total without a single structural failure and with 0 signal degradation. It was smaller than she had imagined. The photographs in the archives always portrayed it against empty space, which gave it a scale without reference. In reality, it was simply a functional structure, not elegant in a decorative sense, but with a geometry that suggested it had been designed by someone who had thought a lot about what needed to last and what needed to be clear. The transmission reached her ship in all 48 languages the translator supported, plus 7 that were cataloged as learned since the unit's installation. She sent a response. It wasn't established protocol. It was simply the impulse of someone who had traveled very far to remain silent. Beacon of the Terran Confederation. My name is Kale Mir. I am a descendant of those who crossed your border 300 years ago. I have come to pay my respects and to say that we understand. The response arrived in 42 seconds. A human voice, new, different from any voice in the historical records, with the texture of someone who had been awakened by the received transmission and had chosen to respond personally rather than letting the automatic system answer on its own. Kael'mir, we read your thesis. It's good. Your understanding of the philosophy of containment is better than some of our own students. A pause. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the honesty. It means a lot. Another pause. Every species defines itself by its choices. Your ancestors chose poorly. You chose well. The transmission ended. The beacon continued glowing in the vacuum, its endless and patient signal reaching out in every direction. A lighthouse that had never been about warning approaching ships. It was, and had always been, about reminding everyone that the hardest power to exercise isn't the power to destroy, it is the power not to destroy when you could. Kael'mir stared at the beacon for a long time. Then she turned on her recording camera and said, with the voice of someone who knows she is speaking to archives that will last long beyond her, 732 years. A structure working alone in the interstellar vacuum, transmitting a plea for peace in 75 languages without ever missing a transmission, without ever stopping, without ever giving up on the idea that someone, at some point, might listen. She looked at the beacon once more. That's the most human part of all this, she said. Not the technology, not the military capacity. The fact that they never stopped believing it was worth it to keep trying. The research ship stayed in Sector 749 for 3 more days while she collected data. The beacon transmitted during all 3 days, steady and patient, as it had been for 312 years before they arrived, and would be for however long was necessary after they left. Out there, in the galaxy that had learned. At the cost learning always demands. The difference between power and wisdom, the silence of the Terran Confederation, remained the most eloquent thing it had ever said. End of story. If the tenacity of the human crew inspired you, subscribe to the channel for more chronicles from the galactic frontier. Every week, a new story about what makes us human, dangerous, impossible to ignore, and sometimes worthy of the galaxy we inhabit.